Hello, everyone, and welcome to Software Testing Reinvented for DevOps. My name is Tanika, and I'm the webinar coordinator here at Tricentis, and I'll be your host and moderator today. Tricentis webinars are a great opportunity to share what's important to our customers, continuous testing, software test automation, and how Tricentis can help your organization accelerate through the DevOps cycle. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. All audience members are on mute. So if you have any questions, you can type them in throughout the question panel, throughout the presentation. So no need to wait until the end. And if there are any questions that are still unanswered by the end of today, we will follow up with you via email. And we are recording today's session, and the video will be made available on demand. One at the link that you see at the bottom of your screen, but also we will email you the link for the recording shortly after today. Today, we're happy to have Wayne Ariola as our speaker, and I will let Wayne introduce himself. Over to you, Wayne.
Thank you, Tanika, and welcome to our brief webinar here. My name is Wayne Ariola. I am the author of Continuous Testing for IT Leaders, as well as an executive at Tricentis, and I'm really happy to be with you here today. I've been in the software testing space for roughly 20 years, and I have never seen a topic that has gained more attention than this idea of digital transformation. And the interesting part about why digital transformation is different than any other initiative that we've seen is that it's become a boardroom topic. Unlike other initiatives that have impacted software testing, such as DevOps or Agile or ALM or different kind of microservices or service-oriented architectures, those topics might not have hit the boardroom. But the concept of digital transformation is definitely a boardroom topic. And the reason why is that businesses are more at risk. It's not like you have an option to go through this digital transformation initiative, right? We're seeing more and more organizations close their doors because they've basically just been run over by, quote unquote, digital transformation. I know here in the US, we see large retailers like Sears, for example, essentially on the border of Chapter 11. And we've seen this really radically hit the retail market, but organizations that have not digitally transformed have certainly met a digital demise. And then we've seen it over and over again, whether it was the Windows application, whether it was AOL, Vine, which everyone was in love with, the Vine application for a short period of time, or Jawbone, which was a great speaker service that basically got eroded by the capabilities of your phone. But we've also seen organizations that have made tremendous strides and become real successors in the digital transformation era. Organizations like New York Times and Walmart, who has competed successfully against Amazon. Fidelity Investments, who have really spent time bridging the experience between the old school investment type interface to really bringing a user in. Or Disney, when you walk onto the Disney property, you experience things really digitally with the Disney experience. So there's definite winners and losers in this market when you come to this idea of digital transformation. But the goal here is that it has really had an impact on software testing. And the reason is that you can't necessarily get the value out of your digital transformation initiative unless you have the idea of transforming software testing. So just to kind of continue on, one of the major issues, or what would we call this, one of the major influencers on the digital transformation and the speed of change is obviously Amazon. And I love this slide. This shows the fastest growing brands between 2006 and 2017, or over the last 11 years. What brand has grown the most? And you can see here that Amazon at 2,662% growth in value. Interesting to me, Domino's, a pizza company, at 1,800% growth. But think about Domino's. Domino's really is the technical leader in this whole pizza industry. They've really invested in digital transformation. And then you see, of course, Apple, AT&T, and obviously Google out there. The more interesting thing in terms of this slide that I find is when you think of the fastest growing brands, you see a lot of organizations that are food companies, the Starbucks, the Burger King, the McDonald's, the Domino's, the Taco Bell. And those are certainly branded items. But digital transformation is going to impact them as well. And you see each one of these organizations transform. You walk into Starbucks today and your mobile phone becomes the centerpiece of your Starbucks interaction. You walk into a McDonald's today and you order through a separate interface rather than really going to an counter and ordering your special meal or your packaged meal today. So digital transformation impacts everything. And if you really think about Amazon's digital brand, the idea here is that, you might not even know that you're ordering from a organization like Zappos, or you might know you're ordering from Zappos, but that's all part of the Amazon's digital family. And it's a family of properties as well as part of the Amazon experience that is growing and evolving significantly. And this is really the next era. It's the next piece of the puzzle when you really talk about what is the impact of digital transformation on our economy. And it comes down to a very basic question. Are you actively becoming a digital company? Or I guess the alternative is really the digital demise. And this is why digital transformation is a boardroom topic. So digital transformation certainly requires this idea of continuous testing, but continuous testing really has a lot of different kind of nuances to it. First of all, it's a responsibility. It's a responsibility to make sure that the organization is earning the trust of its end users. It's confidence. It's meaning that your digital brand or your organization's brand has the confidence of delivering the day-to-day expectations of your end users. It's agility, and I know agility is something we've been striving for in the last decade, but it's being able to deliver changes faster and really more responsively. And finally, it's trust. And not trust necessarily from a security angle, but that does play into the picture here too. But it's trust from the fact that you are now part of your end user's life. And the expectation is that whatever the experience you wish them to have is actually achievable. I know more and more my dependence on my mobile phone or my mobile application is really significant. And when something doesn't work, the impact of something failing has much, much more of an impact on me than it has ever before. So what else is happening, though, in terms of software testing? And, this is a series of observations that have come from the World Quality Report. But the other thing that's happening from a testing perspective as a percentage of IT budget is it's increasing. There's various reports on this number. But when I have the ability to speak to CIOs and they talk about what they're spending on software testing, it really does range anywhere from 25 to 40% of their total IT application budget is actually allocated to the activities around quality. This puts software testing really in the crosshairs of the senior leadership, meaning it's an expense item, which really brings a lot of eyeballs to the table. And when you really look at software testing with the need for speed and the fact that it is a high expense item, it's becoming more and more of a discussion topic. Now, also from an evolution perspective, you got to see how software testing follows a basic trend here. So the first thing that happens is system architectures have basically oscillated, I should say, but from a centralized to a much more decentralized set of integrated systems. So in the past, we know we had some monolithic applications out there, but we've evolved into really a set of integrated systems that are becoming much, much more distributed. So cloud native applications, the advent of microservices, the orchestration of those microservices, this is where the trend is in terms of decentralization of the system architecture. The interesting thing here is that dev team structures have also followed this idea of decentralization, meaning our development team structure has gone from big, large, centralized waterfall type teams to much, much more decentralized teams. And what we've seen, as you can see in this curve, it's beginning to dip. And really what's happening here is as development teams begin to decentralize, what's happening is it's more and more difficult to maintain control over epics and deliverables as teams become more fragmented. So in terms of decentralization, we're starting to see dev teams starting to flatten out a bit in terms of how decentralized they are. And we're looking for more and more ways, not necessarily to centralize the dev team structure, but to collaborate more effectively within the dev team structure. And then finally, we see the test team structure. And the test team structure has certainly trailed the dev team structure over time, but we have moved from this more centralized idea of a testing team to a center of excellence, to testers now deployed within the structure of the dev team itself. And now we're looking to take that next step, which I think is going to be more of a mixed model with the test team becoming more decentralized with the dev team, but also having more centralized components of the actual testing team available to test more end-to-end interactions. So the reason why I'm showing this is that we have a combination of factors that are influencing the evolution of testing within the context of digital transformation. As digital transformation initiatives affects or impacts system architectures, both dev team structure and test team structure is also in transition. Which leads us to really what has become more thematically part of the solution, which is continuous testing. So this is the definition of continuous testing, which comes directly from Wikipedia. And let me just read it. Continuous testing is the process of executing automated tests as part of the software delivery pipeline in order to obtain feedback on the business risks associated with a software release as rapidly as possible. And I want to add two things to this definition, and I really do like that definition. But the first thing I want to say is that continuous testing really also has to do with providing the right feedback at the right time, and more importantly, back to the right stakeholders. I think previously as software testing organizations, what we have done is we've produced a lot of results, and those results over time have not necessarily been actionable to a particular stakeholder. And this idea of providing the right feedback at the right time at the right stakeholder, which is actionable, is critical to the success of continuous testing. And then secondarily here, what I'd also like to mention is that continuous testing can really happen at any point in the life cycle. There are certain discussions going on in our industry which basically equates continuous testing with development or more development-oriented testing, and that's certainly true. But continuous testing also has this idea of being an end-to-end mechanism, or even a shift-right mechanism, or a test and production mechanism. So as long as the process of validation or testing delivers the right feedback at the right time to the right stakeholder, which is actionable, it's continuous testing. Excuse me. It's the idea of being able to actually generate the right information at the right time, which makes things more continuous than we have experienced before. The next thing I want to talk about here is the idea of software testing transformation. In the past, what I have noticed in my experience is many organizations look towards tools to be the impetus for change. And as technologists and as practitioners, I think we believe we're smart enough to understand that tools are an enabler, and without an underlying process, the idea of a tool solving our problem is probably pretty far-fetched. But this J-curve, which was actually part of the DevOps report, the State of DevOps report that came in 2018, And we will send you a link to this report as a follow-up to this webinar. It actually explains the transformation required quite good. And I see this over and over again in organizations that we work with. The first thing in terms of transformation to continuous testing, the team forms, and it really identifies some really easy, quick wins, whether it's actually paying more attention to the regression suite, or perhaps using risk-based design to better impact what type of tests are run. And with such low automation to begin with, what happens is automation helps really low performers progress quite rapidly in the cycle. They're getting really good results. The next thing that happens, though, is that as the automation increases, the idea here is that there is so much technical debt in the background that the ability to actually build an effective regression test suite seems like a huge hurdle. And what happens here is this is the point in the process, in the bottom of this curve, where organizations traditionally bail out, or they lose momentum associated with building their automation. And this is the most critical part of the process, this valley of despair, where it seems that it's just an immense amount of work to keep pace with the backlog required to catch up. Organizations, though, and we'll see this in some of the upcoming data that I'll present to you, that fight through this have fantastic results. And when organizations come out of this, and we'll go to the next orange circle here in this graph, you'll see the fact that the regressing back to manual testing actually slows work down. And this is where organizations have a huge choice to make. They're either going to commit or not commit. And there's some data coming up in terms of a survey we did with Forrester that shows that how elite performers, or how high in elite performers, really accelerate through this curve by making a huge top-down commitment to actually adopting test automation. But this J-curve is, I think, I know what major organizations face time and time again, and even teams within those organizations. And it's something that we need to be highly aware of. So this is the research I was talking about. Tricentis with Forrester conducted a really in-depth research piece, and we basically went out to try to ask the questions, what are the definitive software quality metrics for Agile and DevOps? And what we were trying to find was, is there a difference between a laggard and a leader associated with DevOps and Agile? And can that be reflected in how they're measuring success? This was a really critical question that we wanted to ask the community. Essentially, we got a lot of responses from top-tier organizations, as well as a really wide array of senior leaders and practitioners. So this report is available to you. You can go to this URL, innovate.tricentis.com/Forrester-DevOps. We'll also send this out as a follow-up for you. But if you'd like to grab it right now, you can certainly grab this report. It's roughly a 25-page paper. It shows the adoption of continuous testing, but more importantly, it shows this definitive software quality metrics that laggards or leaders, have adopted versus laggards. And let me go through some of this right now. So essentially, there were 603 individuals that actually took the survey. It was 38% came from the U.S. and essentially around the other software development world organizations. We got a lot from France, 9% from the UK. Basically, in the Asia-Pac region, we got a roughly 22% of the respondents. These organizations must have greater than 1,000 employees, and we were looking for people who were full-time practitioners. So the major findings were this. There are 5 core continuous testing practices that DevOps leaders follow. The laggards basically had a high dependence on manual testing. This was the thing I alluded to before as the second point, is leaders are twice as likely to consider automating the software quality process as a critical business differentiator. Laggards are mostly reporting that testing is a bottleneck. DevOps leaders focus on contextual metrics, which actually provide information back into the process, whereas laggards focus on counting metrics like the number of tests. And then finally, DevOps leaders are more likely to measure the user experience across an end-to-end transaction, whereas laggards are more looking at application-specific metrics. So the 5 core continuous testing practices, and here are the most significant differentiators. They implement continuous testing to meet the demands of release frequency. So the frequency of release is really driving the process. They automate the idea of an end-to-end functional test. So they aren't working within the confines of just an application themselves. They're looking at working end-to-end across the entire user experience or across the transaction itself. They shift to testing earlier in the software development lifecycle. This is your traditional shift left. They have included testers as part of their integrated delivery team. And I think this is, we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but they've allocated proper testing budgets and focused on upgrading their testing skills. So time and time again, we've seen that testers are lagging in terms of the process adoption. However, as what we have found is the leaders really have spent a significant amount of time upgrading the skills of their testers to keep pace with the change of their organization. So these are the 5 core continuous testing practices that we see are the most significant differentiators between the leaders and the laggards. And by the way, there's a lot more detail around these 5 points in the report itself. So what else did we find? Well, we found that DevOps leaders use more advanced testing practices. And what we mean by advanced testing practices is, let's take test data management as one of the examples here. Essentially, the leaders had 41% of a chance to actually have adopted advanced test data management techniques versus the laggards who basically adopted test data management only 24% of the time. Other ideas like TDD or continuous integration, if you look at continuous integration about halfway down the page, leaders had 35% likelihood to use CI, whereas laggards only had 20% chance of be using CI. And this is, up and down the board, what we have found is that the DevOps leaders or the Agile leaders were much, much more likely to follow or use a more advanced software testing practice, which also goes to show that manual testing truly does dominate the laggards and creates that barrier to speed. So the next thing here is automation. DevOps leaders had a higher level of test automation across the board, across those practices as well. So not just using manual validation associated with different types of techniques here. And acceptance testing is probably the biggest scenario here that we could talk about here. So acceptance testing, 61% were likely to use automation for acceptance testing versus 34% of the laggards. We'll use the test data management and provisioning, or test environment management and provisioning, as a good example here as well. Roughly 57% of leaders use test data management, automated test data management and provisioning techniques, as well as 57% use test environment provisioning as a more automated process versus laggards who are doing things more manually or more ad hoc. So this idea of actually taking automation to the next step is really a major theme of the difference between a leader and a laggard. And just to be perfectly clear about this question, and we asked, using your best estimate, how much do you automate each of the following? And automation meant that you're over 50% automated in each one of these areas. And that you could see the overwhelming light blue bar versus the dark blue bar, which represents more the laggards. Excuse me. And I think here, one of the major points that we found in the entire study was this idea that the leaders truly considered automation a critical business differentiator. And what I mean by this is that when given the opportunity to answer the question, how do you consider, compared with other IT processes in your organization, can you rate the importance of automating your software quality process? You could see in the top two boxes a real interesting response here is the leaders, the dark blue bar, the leaders in the dark blue bar here, truly considered it critical. 53% thought or would say that their software quality process, automating the software quality process, was absolutely critical. And if you go down to the next box, which is important, or saying that they considered it a strategic priority and they considered it important, you could see an interesting shift here is that the laggards, 54% said it's important. But look at the difference between the two. It's really interesting here to see that in the area in which you could define what a leader was, 53% said that it's absolutely dead on critical versus 27%. And for the people who were not considered leaders, if they considered it just important, it was 54%. And this might be splitting hairs when you look at it one way, but the true difference here is that when it's considered critical, it's part of a strategic initiative in which the organization will continue to invest in. And it's critical to get you through, if you remember that J curve slide that I presented earlier, this is the differentiator that gets organizations through the J curve. If it's important, that's fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is an imperative to your organization or your process. And the difference here is the people who found it absolutely critical, no negotiating, were the ones who were most likely considered leaders. Okay. I think this is probably one of the most important findings in the study itself. And although it might seem a little nuanced, I think in the back of your mind, the question you need to be asking yourself is, does my organization truly think that automation is critical, or is it somewhat of a nice to have? If you're going after scaled Agile or scaling DevOps, and if speed is critical, you need to promote this idea of making it a strategic initiative within your organization. Okay, so this was actually one of the bonus findings in the research that we did, but I find it pretty interesting. Your C-level folks, the CXOs, are overwhelmingly overestimating the maturity of your DevOps and continuous testing initiative. So essentially, on your left here, we asked a question about a DevOps, and on the right, we asked the question about continuous testing. So the green is a DevOps question, and the blue is the continuous testing response. And essentially, the non-CXO's response versus the CXO's response is the light green, and on the left side, the non-CXO response is the light blue, and the dark blue is the CXO response. So when asked the question, where are you in your maturity, CXOs overwhelmingly, say that they are far ahead of their maturity versus the non-CXOs when it comes to DevOps and continuous testing maturity. So again, on the left side of this graph, it's DevOps. On the right side of this graph is continuous testing. And if you look at the response from far ahead, you could see that CXOs overwhelmingly, 44%, say that they're far ahead in their maturity, while the non-CXOs, only 20% say that they're far ahead. Now, the non-CXOs would say that they're slightly ahead, and this mirrors the same thing between DevOps and continuous testing. So if we shift over to continuous testing, it's even more pronounced in the blue area here. The non-CXOs, only 14% would say that they are far ahead in terms of maturity, whereas the CXOs, 44% say that they're pretty far ahead in continuous testing maturity. This is a pretty huge finding, and it has impacts to your organization. So if we go back to the J curve and we go back to this concept of making sure that automation is critical, this means that we're going to have to sell our CXOs much, much more heavily on the concepts of automation and the investment to automate, because they're already thinking that your organization is mature. And this is something to keep in the back of your mind. And this is even more compounded from this idea of the CXO significantly overestimating their total maturity. So if you look at the CXOs and the non-CXOs here, so on the left side we have the CXOs, and on the right side we have the non-CXOs. Essentially, what you're showing here is that when we ask the question, do you follow best practices? The CXOs, 57% of the CXOs say yes, they do follow best practices. And when you look at the non-CXOs, basically, when asked if they don't follow the best practice there, or you have the maturity associated with the best practices, you can see the split really more in favor of the non-CXOs in terms of how do they follow best practices. And this differential, so what you're really looking here is on the left, you're looking at do they follow best practices, which is 57%, and on the right, do you follow best practices, which is only 26%. You can look at the differential there. Essentially, what this slide is saying is your CXOs also believe that you're following best practices by a significant percent difference than non-CXOs, which means that there is an overestimate in terms of how a CXO really looks at the overall maturity of the organization, which also leads us to the fact that when we're looking for investment dollars associated with maturing our automation or investing in automation, we also have a gap. And this gap we're going to have to continuously educate our senior leaders on as we move forward with our DevOps, Agile, or continuous testing initiatives. Okay? So that was the findings. And by the way, again, we'll send this link out to you so you can download the report. If not, I'm just going to flash this URL again to you. I know this is somewhat unprofessional, but here's this URL, innovate.tricentis.com/Forrester-DevOps. And you can get this exact report, this 25-page report that was actually released last year. So, as part of our journey towards automation and best practices, I wanted to just update you on where Tricentis is in terms of the evolution of supporting or reinventing this idea of software testing for Agile and DevOps. So the Tricentis offers a continuous testing platform, and there's 3 pillars to the platform. The first pillar is Agile Dev Testing. And our Agile Dev Testing module is focused on scaling in-sprint test management. And it's primarily focused on the enablement or making open source test automation much, much more productive. Within our Agile Dev Testing offering, we also offer exploratory testing and BDD. So we think of our Agile Dev Testing component as our shift left component, which enables an organization that is committed to perhaps using a solution like Selenium to make that more productive and to scale across teams. Today, what we have seen in particular within the Agile Dev Testing space is that multiple teams have selected independent tools, and that selection of independent tools provides pretty good feedback to the smaller team. But when that information needs to be rolled up into a broader process, it's a little more difficult. And this is where this solution actually starts to shine. It gives you the ability to scale your in-sprint testing, number one. And number two, it aggregates the information from multiple testing tools, whether it's open source or commercial, to give you a consolidated single pane of glass associated with quality. The second pillar of the continuous testing platform from Tricentis is automated continuous testing. And this is a module which is focused on functional regression testing and the management of resilient regression testing that can cross any architecture or application speed. But the whole goal here is to produce these tests at the speed of change. So we know that if we change application A in a series of transactions that might have application A through E, that changing one component of application A has an impact on the entire transaction. We need to be able to actually change the regression test. We need to be able to actually create new regression tests. And we got to do this at the speed that the business expects. And this automated regression or automated continuous testing solution is focused just on this. Its main component is model-based test automation, which creates an abstraction, allowing you to actually create tests much more rapidly, but more importantly, maintain the test suite much, much more agilely, right? So meaning that it allows you to make the changes more automatically and then actually reproduce the test suite rapidly. And then finally, distributed load testing. Cloud-based performance labs at the fingertips of every developer and tester for on-demand load testing. So as we see architectures become much, much more distributed, ideas like microservices become more prominent and the expansion of APIs and web services, the idea of being able to actually do performance testing on these components early is not only really attractive, but it's required. Even minimal performance testing executed early in the life cycle of a service is critical to that service's success, okay? And using distributed load testing, in this case, this is a solution called Flood, gives an organization the ability to put a performance lab at the fingertips of every developer, meaning every developer can actually performance test its service or its microservice at a rapid pace, giving them a good view into potentially what could be the constraints of that service as the demand on an independent microservice or demand on an API grows over time. I can't emphasize more and more how this is going to become a critical part of a developer's life as an architecture becomes more highly distributed. Tying these items together really is the Tricentis Analytics, which is a reporting engine and a big data tool that allows you to have cross-project and portfolio visibility. But more importantly, the Tricentis Analytics also is this engine that allows you to manage your release expectations. So it lets you understand the impacts and the risk of a release candidate, and more importantly, across a transaction or across a user experience. So pulling all the data together across an independent tool sets, allowing you to have a single view of the quality or the risk of a potential release candidate. And to break this apart, just to give you a little bit more of a attachment to the particular tool set I'm talking about, our Agile Dev testing solution is called Tricentis Q-Test. And the idea for Tricentis Q-Test is really to make open source more productive. This is either a cloud-based or a on-prem solution, which gives you the ability to interact with your Jira or your Agile management infrastructure. But it really, at the end of the day, I consider this tool extraordinarily valuable because it pulls together all the disparate information that's being generated by open source tools. The second thing is automated continuous testing, and this is Tricentis Tosca. This is, from an analyst perspective, identified as the #1 continuous testing solution out there on the market today, generated by what's called model-based test automation. Model-based test automation allows you to create an abstraction layer for the actual test steps that you're trying to execute across applications and gives you the ability to actually construct, maintain, and execute end-to-end test suites really, really rapidly. It's really a highly dynamic and a very valuable technology, and it needs to be considered for any organization that's looking to either scale Agile or adopt DevOps. And then finally, the distributed load testing is represented by Tricentis Flood. And Tricentis Flood is this concept of having really a performance lab at the fingertips or at the desktop of each one of your developers. So these three pillars represent the Tricentis continuous testing platform. And it's something that I encourage you to check out if your organization is looking to actually increase the speed of your release cycles. So here's my key recommendations as I'm wrapping this thing up for today. is, first, make business risk the driver of your metrics program. So adding context to your metrics. A lot more about adding business risk to your metrics program is provided in the report. Secondly, here is ruthlessly automate your testing and your QA processes, and not necessarily within necessarily a team or an app, but also end to end. And then finally, prioritize test execution predicated around business risk itself. And by the way, there's a lot more information around these 3 points in the report, the Joint Forrester report that I mentioned previously. So, Tanika, I think that brings me to the end of the content I prepared. Are there any questions that have come through the presentation or the webinar platform?
Yeah, Wayne, there definitely are lots of questions that have come in. So thanks very much for your presentation. Definitely food for thought, as I can see. I wanted to be mindful of everybody's time. So I'm going to sort of pick out a couple of themes that seem to repeat in some of these questions. And especially your summary slide, a lot of it touches on sort of what you had put up there. So for example, obviously there's a lot of talk about automating continuous testing. But where does exploratory testing then fit sort of into that landscape? Because that's also very valuable for sort of the user experience.
So it's for me, it's not odd to see that exploratory testing pops up as a question. It's a really hot topic right now, especially in the context of looking at user experience in context of the whole software delivery life cycle. So exploratory testing is really interesting because it gets the users to switch their brain a little bit and not necessarily be so concerned about coding something for test, but really be concerned about what the user experience is, and how, and is it intended, and does it meet the expectations of the application itself. So exploratory testing, I think, is an imperative. I think the one thing that exploratory testing hasn't necessarily done and should be considered for is really an early way to get a broader audience involved in more shift left type activity. So meaning as soon as the UI is somewhat solidified, or you're getting to a point where you have the ability to say, hey, I want feedback, this is where some more organizations like Tricentis have automated a lot of the exploratory testing techniques to allow you to aggregate the input of multiple and different users. So you're going to get the different perspectives of the business user, the technical user, the developer, whoever might be involved in the product itself. So exploratory testing fits within any software delivery lifecycle, but I would say more successfully, it should be deployed earlier in the cycle.
That's really interesting, because there's actually a perfect kind of follow-on question there, because you mentioned, having the process kind of spread out across more, and maybe, like you said, shift left. So then, the sort of natural follow-up question then is, what about shifting right? What are your opinions on that?
Yeah. So by the way, I am really intrigued on shift right personally, and I've been doing a lot of research on this topic. This actually goes back to one of the slides in the presentation, which is the definition of continuous testing. And continuous testing can happen at any part in the software delivery lifecycle. I do believe as an industry, we have truly focused the efforts of testing far too much on the idea of a requirement or what's new versus shifting testing to the right, which is more about understanding the impact of changes on the actual users themselves. So pulling data in from production, understanding or defending the ground right before production to get a better sense of what do I need to improve, or how can I improve the current experience. I think we wait far too long for bug reports to come in, or for our help desk organization to deliver information associated with something that's failing, which we could eliminate by better observation of information from production, and pulling that into our defect fixes much earlier in the cycle. On the other hand, there's one more point here, that I would like to make, is that from an industry perspective, I think from a software testing perspective, we've actually kind of gone into software testing thinking that everything must be tested. And I think this is the wrong concept. I think what would be better is if we thought about what don't we need to test and eliminate that from our scope of what needs to occur. And given that, we could push things into production much more quickly. However, that also requires that we're monitoring production for the things that we have bypassed to make sure that it's working. So that is the idea of being able to shift right as well. So this tie together with the full life cycle.
Yeah, thanks for that answer, Wayne. I feel like that's kind of a whole separate webinar in and of itself, or it could be.
It really is. It's also hard to summarize. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, maybe that's an idea for us. And I think to sort of end the Q&A today, a nice kind of another question I think a lot of people did have, which was, the importance, you talk about the importance of adding context, bearing in mind business risk. But is there anything inherently wrong with focusing on the number of tests as well? I mean, should people just stop doing that?
Yeah, this is always a very contentious topic. So does number of tests matter? To put it bluntly, yes, the number of tests, automated tests, matter in a very binary mode when you're talking about the difference between none and some. So that's the only thing that matters, meaning the count of tests doesn't give me any contextual information about the quality of the application. If you have one automated test, is that good or bad? I can't tell you. I just don't know what that covers, and I don't understand the risk impact of that test. So the point here when you talk about counting metrics is don't depend on counting metrics, nor should counting metrics be a KPI associated with your testers. The idea here is to get to risk coverage, to better understand the context of your effort. So if I understand that I have, for example, 10% risk coverage, that's pretty contextual, versus do I have 80% risk coverage? You could tell the difference between that, versus, hey, I got 5 tests versus 40 tests. What does that tell me? Well, it tells you absolutely nothing. So yes, you can keep counting tests, but you need to get to better contextual metrics in order for you to have much more automated types of release statistics and release data. And I think Tanika, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us today who've been watching and asking great questions. Like I mentioned earlier, do look out for an email that we will send you with a follow-up with the recording, so you can review anything that you want to review. And any questions that we did not get around to today, we will follow up with you as well. So do not worry. Thanks again to Wayne, and see you at the next Tricentis webinar.
Thank you so much.